Montana Territory, 1869. The chill of autumn had settled over the Gallatin Valley, turning the distant Bridger Mountains into a canvas of amber and gold. The frontier had been slowly yielding to civilization, but out here, 30 miles from the nearest town, a man was still measured by his grit, his horse, and his word. For Samuel Colt, 26 years old and already hardened by the unforgiving landscape, the frontier was no place for softness. Love was a luxury meant for the pampered folks back east who had never faced a blizzard with dwindling supplies or stared down rustlers intent on stealing everything a man had worked for. Sam ran calloused fingers through his sandy brown hair as he surveyed the small ranch he'd built over 4 years of backbreaking work. The two-room cabin, barn, and corral represented everything he believed in: self-reliance and the freedom to live without depending on anyone. People were temporary, they left or died. The land was the only constant. "You keep staring at those clouds like you're expecting them to talk back," called Jeremiah, Sam's weathered ranch hand who'd been with him since the beginning. "Snow's coming early this year," Sam replied, his green eyes narrowing at the horizon. His lean, muscular frame tensed at the thought. Another brutal winter to survive alone. "Might be time to consider what I mentioned," Jeremiah said, leaning against the fence post. "My sister's friend knows a widow heading west, says she's looking for work any kind, cooking, cleaning. You need someone to keep this place from falling apart while we're working the herd." Sam's jaw tightened. "I don't need complications." "A hot meal and clean shirts ain't complications, boy, they're necessities." But Sam knew better. People meant attachment, and attachment meant inevitable loss. He'd learned that lesson at 12 when influenza took both his parents in a single cruel week. He'd learned it again at 20 when his brother died in a mining accident up in Virginia City. The frontier took everything eventually. Better to need nothing and no one. "I'll think about it," he lied. 2 weeks later, Sam cursed his weakness as he rode into Helena to meet the stagecoach. Jeremiah's persistent badgering had worn him down, especially after Sam had nearly burned down the cabin attempting to cook a rabbit stew. It was practical, he told himself, nothing more than hiring help like taking on another ranch hand. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust, the 6-horse team sweating despite the October chill. Sam hung back, hat in hand, as passengers disembarked. The letter had described her as a young woman of 22 years, with wheat-colored hair and reliable disposition. He spotted her immediately, standing uncertainly beside a small trunk. Her blue calico dress was travel-worn but clean, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun beneath a modest bonnet. Even from a distance, Sam could see she was far too pretty for a housekeeper, exactly the kind of complication he'd feared. "Miss O'Hara?" he asked, approaching reluctantly. She turned, and Sam found himself looking into eyes the color of summer cornflowers. Her face was heart-shaped, with high cheekbones dusted pink from the cold, and a small straight nose sprinkled with faint freckles. "Naomi O'Hara," she confirmed, her voice soft but steady. "You must be Mr. Colt." "Samuel Sam," he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Just Sam is fine." She nodded, studying him with an intelligence that made him uncomfortable. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Colt. I understand the position involves cooking and housekeeping duties." The formality in her tone helped settle him. This was business, nothing more. "That's right. Room and board plus $8 a month." "That will be satisfactory." She glanced at her trunk. "Shall we proceed?" The businesslike exchange should have reassured him, but as he loaded her trunk onto the wagon, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't predict. The 3-hour journey to the ranch passed mostly in silence. Occasionally, Sam would point out landmarks: the creek where he watered his cattle in summer, the ridge where wolves sometimes appeared in winter. Naomi listened attentively, her eyes taking in the vast landscape with an expression he couldn't quite read. Only once did she volunteer information about herself. "I was married for 3 years to a shopkeeper in Illinois," she said quietly as they passed a solitary grave marker on the trail. "Influenza took him last winter." Sam nodded, keeping his eyes on the trail. "The frontier's hard on everyone." "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady despite the pain it must have carried. "But I'd rather face its hardships honestly than pretend life offers guarantees." Something in her words resonated uncomfortably with Sam. He'd been telling himself his isolation was wisdom, not fear. He changed the subject to safer territory, explaining the layout of the ranch and her duties. The first weeks established a cautious routine. Naomi proved herself competent in the kitchen and tireless in her efforts to bring order to the cabin. Sam and Jeremiah would leave at dawn to work with the cattle, returning to find the small home transformed. The dirt floor was swept smooth, the windows clear of grime, and meals waiting that made their previous attempts at cooking seem like animal feed by comparison. Sam maintained his distance, speaking to Naomi only when necessary, taking meals quickly before retreating outside or to his bedroom. But his awareness of her presence grew despite his determination. He noticed the way sunlight caught in her hair when she hung laundry, how she hummed softly while kneading bread, the grace in her movements as she worked. The first snowfall came in late November, earlier than usual. Sam returned from checking the herd to find Naomi standing outside, face turned up to the gently falling flakes, eyes closed and a small smile playing on her lips. "You'll catch your death," he said gruffly, dismounting. Her eyes opened but the smile remained. "Perhaps, but I've always loved the first snow. It makes the world clean again, don't you think?" Sam looked around at the white blanket beginning to cover the ranch. "Makes everything harder is what it does." "Not everything worth having comes easy, Mr. Colt." Her eyes met his directly, and for a moment he couldn't look away. That night, instead of retreating immediately after dinner, Sam remained at the table while Naomi cleared the dishes. The wind had picked up outside, driving snow against the windows. "How did you end up out here?" he found himself asking. Surely there were positions back east. Naomi paused, her back to him as she washed a plate. "After Daniel, my husband, died, there seemed little point staying where everything reminded me of him." She turned, drying her hands on her apron. "And perhaps I wanted to see if I could stand on my own, face something entirely new." "The frontier breaks more people than it makes," Sam said. "So does grief," she replied simply. "At least here the dangers are honest ones." Before he could respond, a particularly fierce gust rattled the windows. Naomi glanced toward the small room off the kitchen that had become hers. "Your room gets the north wind," Sam said, rising. "I'll bring in more firewood for your stove." "Thank you." Her smile was genuine, warming something in him he thought had frozen long ago. As winter deepened, the enforced proximity began to wear away at Sam's carefully constructed walls. Blizzards kept them confined to the cabin for days at a time. To break the monotony, Naomi would read aloud from one of the few books she'd brought, poetry and stories that transported them far from the howling Montana winter. Sometimes she convinced Sam to tell stories of his earlier days on the frontier, listening with such genuine interest that he found himself sharing memories he'd long kept buried. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm raged, Sam found himself telling her about his parents and brother. "That's why you keep everyone at arm's length," Naomi said softly when he finished. "You're afraid to lose anyone else." Sam stared into the fire. "It's not fear, it's wisdom. Out here, attachment is a liability." "Is it?" Her voice was gentle. "It seems to me that connection is what helps people survive the frontier. No one makes it alone, not really." "I have," he said more sharply than he intended. "Have you?" Naomi's gaze was steady. "What about Jeremiah, the neighbors who helped raise your barn?" "Even taking me in, that was reaching for connection, whether you admit it or not." Sam stood abruptly. "I took you in because I needed a housekeeper, Miss O'Hara, nothing more." The hurt that flashed across her face made him immediately regret his words, but pride kept him from taking them back. He retreated to his room, lying awake long into the night as her words echoed in his mind. December brought a brief thaw, allowing Sam and Jeremiah to ride out to check the herd. They found signs of wolves tracking the cattle and spent several days building bonfires around the perimeter and taking turns standing watch. When they finally returned to the ranch, Sam was surprised by the intensity of his relief at seeing smoke rising from the cabin chimney. Inside, the warmth and smell of baking bread wrapped around him like a physical embrace. Naomi looked up from the stove, her face lighting with relief. "Thank goodness," I was beginning to worry. The genuine concern in her voice caught Sam off guard. "Wolves," he explained, hanging his snow-crusted coat by the door, "had to protect the herd." She nodded, already moving to pour him coffee. There's hot water for washing up. And stew ready whenever you are. That night, as they sat before the fire, Sam noticed Naomi's hands were red and chapped from soap and cold water. Here, he said impulsively, reaching for a tin of salve he used for saddle sores and chapped skin. This helps. When she extended her hands, he found himself applying the salve himself, gently rubbing it into her small, capable hands. Her skin was soft despite the roughness from work, and the simple contact sent an unexpected warmth through him. Thank you, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. Sam nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting. Just practical, he managed. Can't have you unable to work. But they both knew something had shifted between them. Christmas arrived with another blizzard. Sam had never marked the holiday since his family died, but on Christmas Eve, he returned from the barn to find Naomi had decorated the cabin with pine boughs and hand-cut paper snowflakes. A small cake sat on the table alongside two carefully wrapped packages. You didn't need to do all this, he said, uncomfortable with the effort she'd made. I wanted to, Naomi replied. Christmas should be marked even in the wilderness. Perhaps especially in the wilderness. After dinner, she handed him one of the packages. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf of dark blue wool. I noticed your old one was more holes than yarn, she explained, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Sam ran his fingers over the careful stitches, remembering his mother knitting by firelight. It's been a long time since anyone gave me a gift, he admitted. Thank you. Embarrassed, he reached into his pocket. I didn't know what to. He held out a small carved wooden horse. It's not much. Naomi took it reverently. Did you make this? He nodded. My father taught me, haven't carved in years. It's beautiful, she whispered, tracing the lines with her finger. Truly. That night, for the first time, Sam played the harmonica his father had given him, filling the cabin with haunting frontier melodies while snow fell silently outside. January brought the coldest temperatures Sam had experienced in his years on the frontier. The creek froze solid, forcing them to break ice each morning for water. One particularly brutal morning, Naomi insisted on helping despite Sam's objections. I'm not made of china, Mr. Colt, she said firmly, pulling on her coat. Sam, he corrected. After months, her continued formality sometimes stung, and it's not about being delicate, that wind cuts like a knife. All the more reason you shouldn't face it alone, she replied, wrapping the scarf she'd made him more securely around his neck. The simple gesture, her hands at his throat, her face close to his, stopped his protests. Together they battled the elements, working in tandem to break the ice and haul water back to the cabin. Later, as they warmed themselves by the fire, Sam studied Naomi's profile. Why did you really come west? He asked. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. After Daniel died, his brother made it clear he expected me to marry him, she finally said. It was that or return to my father's house as a dependent once again. Neither option allowed me to be myself. And who is that? Yourself. Naomi smiled slightly. I'm still discovering that, but I know I want to be more than someone's possession or obligation. She looked at him directly. I want to be valued for my own worth, not for what I can provide. You are, Sam said before he could stop himself. Valued, I mean. The color that rose in her cheeks made something twist in his chest. February brought more snow, but also the first hints that winter's grip might eventually loosen. One clear morning, Sam found Naomi outside watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink. It's like the world is new, she said as he joined her. Like anything is possible. Sam looked at her instead of the sunrise, seeing the hope in her face. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder what it might be like to share more than just space with another person, to share a future. The thought terrified him. That night they were startled by pounding at the door. Sam grabbed his rifle before opening it to find two men supporting a third between them, all half frozen and desperate. Our wagon broke an axle 5 miles back, explained the leader, a gaunt man with haunted eyes. My brothers got frostbite, we saw your chimney smoke. Despite his instinct to protect his isolation, Sam couldn't turn away people in danger. He helped bring the injured man inside while Naomi immediately began preparing hot drinks and food. For 3 days, the strangers sheltered with them while the injured man's feet were treated and the weather cleared enough for travel. Sam watched as Naomi tended the man's frostbite with gentle efficiency, her compassion evident in every gesture. On the third night, as the travelers shared their story of heading to Oregon for a fresh start, Sam caught Naomi watching him with an expression he couldn't interpret. "You've been mighty generous," said the leader as they prepared to leave the next morning. Sam had repaired their wagon and provided supplies for the journey. "Anyone would do the same," Sam said uncomfortably. "No," the man replied, "they wouldn't. Plenty would have let us freeze rather than risk their own supplies." After they departed, Naomi touched Sam's arm. "He's right, you know, your kindness saved their lives." "It wasn't kindness," Sam insisted. "Just human decency." "Which is becoming rarer out here," she countered. "You pretend to be hard, Samuel Colt, but you're a good man." The word stayed with him long after, challenging the image he'd constructed of himself as a lone wolf needing no one. March brought the first real thaw, turning the ground to mud and swelling the creek with snowmelt. Sam and Jeremiah were working from dawn until dusk preparing for calving season, often returning to the cabin exhausted and mud-covered. One evening, Sam came in to find Naomi at the table writing a letter, her face pensive. "Bad news?" he asked, pouring himself coffee. She looked up, seeming startled from deep thought. "No, just possibilities." At his questioning look, she hesitated. "I received a letter from a friend in Fort Benton. She says there's need for a schoolteacher there. The pay is good." Something cold settled in Sam's stomach. "You're thinking of leaving." "My arrangement here was always temporary," she said carefully. "And spring seems the natural time for new beginnings." Sam nodded stiffly, unable to articulate the sudden emptiness the thought of her leaving created. "Of course you should. Consider what's best for you." That night he lay awake confronting truths he'd been avoiding for months. Naomi had transformed more than just his cabin. She'd begun to transform him, challenging his belief that isolation was the only safe way to live on the frontier. The prospect of returning to his solitary existence now seemed not like safety but like punishment. The next morning, Sam rode out before dawn, pushing himself and his horse hard, as if physical exertion could outrun the emotions churning inside him. By mid-morning, heavy clouds had gathered, and as he turned back toward the ranch, the sky opened in a deluge of spring rain. The creek had risen dangerously by the time he reached it, its normally placid waters transformed into a churning brown torrent carrying debris from upstream. As Sam hesitated on the bank, searching for the safest crossing point, he heard a scream carried on the wind. Upstream, a horse was struggling in the current, its rider clinging desperately to the saddle. With horror, Sam recognized Naomi's wheat-colored hair and blue dress. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse along the bank, racing to get ahead of where Naomi was being swept downstream. The rain pelted his face as he pushed through brush and over rocks, keeping pace with the current. At a slight bend where the creek widened, Sam urged his horse into the raging water. The animal fought against the current, powerful legs struggling to find purchase on the slippery creek bed. Sam fixed his eyes on Naomi, who was barely managing to keep her head above water as her exhausted horse was carried sideways by the current. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar of the water. "I'm coming." Their eyes met across the churning water, and the fear he saw in hers was eclipsed by something else: trust. She believed he would reach her. Sam maneuvered his horse parallel to the current, and as Naomi was swept toward him, he leaned far out from the saddle. Their hands connected, fingers gripping with desperate strength. With a mighty effort, Sam pulled her from her failing horse and up behind him. The added weight nearly unbalanced them, but his horse fought its way toward the bank, finally finding solid ground. They collapsed on the muddy shore, Naomi coughing up water, both of them soaked to the skin and shaking with cold and relief. "What were you doing out here?" Sam demanded, fear making his voice harsh as he wrapped his coat around her trembling shoulders. "Looking for you," Naomi gasped between coughs. Jeremiah said, "Storm coming," worried. The admission stunned him. She had risked her life because she was concerned for his safety. "We need to get you warm," he said more gently, helping her onto his horse and mounting behind her. Her body shivered against his chest as he held her secure with one arm and guided the horse with the other. By the time they reached the cabin, Naomi's lips were blue with cold. Sam carried her inside, barking orders at a startled Jeremiah to stoke the fire and heat water. As he helped her out of her sodden dress and into dry clothes, keeping his eyes averted for modesty, the reality of how close he'd come to losing her hit him with physical force. "You could have died," he said hoarsely as he tucked blankets around her before the roaring fire. "So could you," she replied, her voice weak but determined. "Every day out here holds that risk, Sam. That's why isolating yourself is such a waste." Her words pierced through the last of his defenses. As he knelt beside her, tenderly drying her hair with a towel, Sam finally surrendered to the truth he'd been fighting for months. "Don't go to Fort Benton," he said quietly. Naomi's eyes, still luminous despite her exhaustion, searched his face. "Why should I stay?" "Because the words stuck in his throat, years of self-imposed emotional isolation making them almost impossible to say. "Because I need you, not as a housekeeper, as what, Sam?" she pressed, her hand finding his. "As the woman I love," he finally managed. "I love you, Naomi. I've been fighting it because loving means risking loss, and I convinced myself I couldn't survive losing anyone else. But today I realized the only thing I truly couldn't survive is losing you." Tears filled her eyes. "I've been waiting so long to hear you say that." "Does that mean you'll stay?" Hope rose in his chest. "It means I love you too," she whispered. "And yes, I'll stay not as your servant but as your equal." Sam took her face gently between his hands. "You've always been more than I deserved," he said before kissing her with all the tenderness and passion he'd been holding back. The following weeks passed in a daze of happiness Sam had never thought possible. As Naomi regained her strength, they planned their future together. Sam proposed properly on the first truly warm day of spring, kneeling among wildflowers with a simple gold band he'd ridden all the way to Helena to purchase. "I can't offer you an easy life," he said, holding her hands in his. "The frontier will always be hard, but I promise to face every challenge with you as partners, to never again hide behind walls of fear, to cherish every day we're granted together." Naomi's smile outshone the sun as she accepted both the ring and his promise. "The frontier doesn't frighten me, Sam. Nothing does when we're together." They were married in May by a traveling preacher, with Jeremiah and neighbors from miles around gathering to celebrate. As they stood together under the big Montana sky, exchanging vows, Sam marveled at how completely his view of the world had transformed. The false belief that had guided him for so long, that love was a weakness on the frontier, had been replaced by the truth Naomi had taught him. Love was the very strength needed to thrive in this beautiful, harsh land. Connection didn't make you vulnerable, it made you resilient. That autumn, as they sat together on the porch of their expanded cabin watching the golden light paint the distant mountains, Naomi placed Sam's hand on her still flat stomach. "We'll need to add another room by spring," she said with a smile that held all the promise of their future. Sam pulled her close, overcome with gratitude for the woman who had entered his life as a servant but had become his entire world. The woman who had taught him that even in the untamed wilderness, the greatest frontier worth exploring was the human heart's capacity for love. "I spent so many years believing the only way to survive out here was to need nothing and no one," he said, pressing his lips to her forehead. "I never imagined that finding someone to love would make every struggle worthwhile." Naomi leaned into his embrace, their bodies fitting together as naturally as the mountains against the sky. "That's the true spirit of the frontier, I think. Not just enduring hardship alone, but building something meaningful together despite it." As the sun set over the land that had once represented only his isolation, Sam Colt held his future in his arms and knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found his true home.